Right, let's just get straight into this. Picture this. You're accelerating down a runway. The engines are roaring and you're getting pushed firmly back into your seat. You hit takeoff speed, the nose of the plane lifts into the air, but the rest of the aircraft aggressively refuses to follow. The tail literally scrapes the tarmac, the engines start backfiring, and pure panic instantly floods the cabin. Well, this is exactly what happened to Delta Flight 1141. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking an aviation disaster that fundamentally changed the way we fly.
So how exactly does a perfectly good airplane crash in just 24 seconds? That is the big core mystery we're looking at today. It's August 1988 at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. You've got a perfectly healthy 14-year-old Boeing 727 with a highly experienced crew. It takes off, stalls almost immediately, and crashes, leaving 14 people dead. So you really have to wonder, how does a totally routine flight turn into a catastrophic disaster in a matter of seconds? Well, to understand that, we need to rewind the clock a bit.
Let's rewind to 8 a.m., a perfectly normal morning. The weather in Dallas was completely clear, the winds were calm, and the crew was incredibly experienced. We're talking about Captain Larry Davis with over 17,000 hours of flight time, First Officer Kirkland with 6,500 hours, and Flight Engineer Stephen Judd. They were rested, comfortable with each other, and everything pointed to a completely smooth trip to Salt Lake City.
But the timeline here actually tells a story of creeping complacency. The pushback from the gate was right on the dot at 8 a.m. But it was a busy morning, and by 8:15, they were stuck in this really long queue on the taxiway. And it's this creeping, slow wait time that started breeding a highly relaxed atmosphere. In fact, it got so relaxed that by 8:50, they allowed a massive 10-minute distraction into the cockpit. Then, right at 9 a.m., a sudden, completely unexpected takeoff clearance catches them totally off guard.
Now, during that long delay, the crew ignored a really crucial regulation, the sterile cockpit rule. This was introduced after a bunch of accidents in the 1970s, and it strictly prohibits pilots from discussing absolutely anything unrelated to the flight from the moment the engines start until the plane climbs above 10,000 feet. Its one and only job is to prevent distractions during these critical phases. But right from pushback, this crew literally tossed that rule straight out the window, casually chatting about their paychecks.
Moving on to the anatomy of a wing and the crucial flaps. Before we get into exactly how that distraction doomed the flight, let's take a quick pivot to understand the mechanics of how a multi-ton metal tube actually gets off the ground.
It's all about the physics here. Think about a plane's cruise wing. It's thin and flat. That is fantastic for slicing efficiently through the air at high speeds and high altitudes. But when a plane is just taking off, it's traveling pretty slow, right? A thin wing simply cannot generate enough lift in slow air. So to fix this, pilots absolutely have to extend the flaps, which essentially makes the wing larger and curved. Setting those flaps is a non-negotiable, literal life-or-death requirement for getting off the ground.
So, keeping that absolute aerodynamic requirement in the back of our minds, let's look at the fatal distraction. We're going to hop back into the cockpit during that extensive taxi delay to see how human factors totally derailed their protocols.
You know that old saying, when everybody's in charge, nobody is in charge? Well, that perfectly captures the dynamic inside Flight 1141. A recent FAA audit of Delta had actually just highlighted a serious lack of standardized cockpit management across the whole airline. Captain Davis ran a very, very loose cockpit, essentially diffusing his responsibilities across the entire crew. And the reality of human psychology is that when everybody feels like they're in charge, nobody is actually actively commanding the situation. The safety boundaries were just completely blurred.
And this total lack of discipline really peaked when a flight attendant stepped into the cockpit. For nearly 10 whole minutes, while the plane is literally crawling along the taxiway, they're casually chatting about food and the upcoming presidential election. At one point, First Officer Kirkland actually jokes that they should discuss dating habits so the media would have something interesting to broadcast if they crashed. He literally said, "We gotta leave something for our wives and children to listen to." It's just a darkly haunting comment, made while they were actively normalizing being distracted.
Which brings us to the rushed checklist. Suddenly, that super relaxed, joking atmosphere was totally shattered. The control tower spotted a gap in traffic and bumped Flight 1141 straight to the very front of the line.
Let's see how this instantly builds into chaos. Caught completely off guard by this sudden clearance, the crew made 3 massive compounding errors. First, they hastily just ripped through the rest of the taxi checklist. Second, they entirely skipped the mandatory takeoff briefing. And third, the fatal blow. When the checklist demanded the flap setting, First Officer Kirkland rapidly recited 15 degrees purely from memory. He didn't look. He didn't physically verify the lever. The flaps were never extended.
This leads right into a terrifying phase, the silent alarm. We have an incredibly dangerous scenario unfolding. A fully loaded Boeing 727 is lining up on the runway, and its wings are completely flat and streamlined for cruising. They are structurally incapable of taking off.
But as you probably know, aviation is built heavily on redundancies. The 727 is equipped with this ultimate safety net called the takeoff warning system. If a pilot pushes those throttles forward for takeoff and the flaps aren't set, this system is designed to sound a blaring, unmistakable alarm right in the cockpit to stop them in their tracks.
So why on earth didn't it save them? Well, it was a totally hidden mechanical betrayal. The electrical contacts connecting the system to the physical throttle levers were heavily corroded. Because of this rot, the warning system only worked intermittently. So when Captain Davis forcefully advanced those throttles to start the takeoff roll, the alarm stayed completely silent. The crew accelerated down the runway, absolutely oblivious to the fact that they were strapped into a doomed aircraft.
Which brings us to the runway, and a disaster in seconds. The aircraft accelerates past 150 knots, reaching VR. That's the exact speed where the captain pulls back to take to the skies.
The nose lifts up, but the main wheels, they just refuse to leave the ground, because without those flaps, they need vastly more speed to actually fly. Immediately, the stick shaker violently activates, literally rattling the controls to warn of an aerodynamic stall. The plane lurches. The right wingtip actually smashes into the pavement, shooting sparks everywhere. The nose gets pulled up so aggressively that the engines can't even ingest air properly, and they start loudly backfiring. The crew, completely panicked and confused, misdiagnoses all of this as an engine failure. They had absolutely no idea the real problem was simply the shape of their wings.
24. That is it. For just 24 agonizing seconds, Delta Flight 1141 was technically airborne. Barely 20 feet off the ground and howling in a total aerodynamic stall, the right wing struck an instrument antenna 1,000 feet past the end of the runway. The wing ruptured into flames and the plane tumbled violently back down to the earth. Ultimately, 14 people tragically lost their lives in the resulting fire. But let's look at the legacy of Flight 1141. Because of a casual conversation and a corroded wire, the entire paradigm of aviation safety shifted forever.
The FAA had to step in, and they acted decisively. On the mechanical side, they mandated that takeoff warning systems be wired directly to the actual engine power output, not just the physical levers, and they required strict testing every 200 hours. Culturally, they really dropped the hammer. The sterile cockpit rule became strictly enforced, and crew resource management, or CRM, was completely overhauled. Airlines basically had to ensure that tasks were explicitly delegated, ensuring that the dangerous everybody-is-in-charge mentality was permanently erased from the cockpit.
And that actually brings us to where we are today in modern aviation. If you step onto a newer jet, like the Boeing 787, the checklists are entirely electronic. You physically cannot tick off a critical item on that screen unless the aircraft's internal computer independently verifies that the flaps are actually in the correct position. The margin for simple human memory error has been technologically engineered right out of the equation. So, to wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final thought. Flight 1141 wasn't brought down by some massive, unavoidable structural failure. It was brought down by an incredibly human chain of complacency, a rushed routine, and just a minor mechanical glitch. It really makes you ask yourself, what minor distractions in our own critical routines are just waiting to compound into a disaster? It's a pretty sobering reminder that discipline absolutely matters. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll catch you in the next one.